This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
You're such a hater, Dael.
I am. I own it.
We want people to start making RPGs. Or don't become a game designer, folks. I'll contradict what I said earlier.
Smooth as a good scotch. Drink responsibly.
Maybe recognize finally that it's not all about us.
We need to send a message that this cannot happen, and somebody has to go.
I can't help but feel like I personally may have contributed a little bit to this.
All that and more right now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the number one podcast in all of Etheris. They listen to it in Valika, they listen to it in Shawn and Astoya and Burak Empire and the Castellan provinces and in Morentia and Lysek, just all over the place. They love the Eldritch Lorecast there, and why wouldn't they? It's such a great podcast. My name is Ben Byrne, and I am here, as always, joined by James Hake, Shawn Merwin, Dael Kingsmill. What songs are on a D&D Christmas album?
Okay, it's beginning to look a lot like Fishmen.
Rocking Round the Owlbear.
Rudolph the Red-Nosed.
Flump.
Yes.
Speaking of flumps, hang on.
Hello, I am the Flump.
If you have any D&D themed Christmas songs to add to the list.
I'm still all for O Damon Oak.
D&D, 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 Simply having a wonderful TPK, says Jake Beats in the chat. This is the musical episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. Every cool show does a musical episode.
Now that's good radio.
Dael, I have to ask you this question coming in from Gethin, loyal listener of the podcast. Which Beholder eye-ray is your favorite? And if you can't remember any of them, what would you love a Beholder eye-ray to be able to do?
Why would you ever think that I can't remember them? I say, Googling them on the side. I'm just trying to double check the name of, I think the most iconic one is my favorite, and that's the like disintegration beam, right?
Yeah.
The invenerating ray, whatever its actual name is, that's the one I'm talking about.
I think it is disintegration.
When I completely wrote the Beholder stat block, because that's just who I am, I can't be stopped, that's the one that I kept. You know,
right.
I think I just called it a death ray.
Well, they have a death ray too.
Right.
They have all sorts of rays, in fact.
Oh, why? It simply must be the petrification beam. I'm a dungeon master. You know, I must have environmental storytelling. There is no more classic, and by classic I mean classical version of environmental storytelling than a bunch of statues of people in horrified poses as your hero comes to slay the monster.
That is true. That is true. I used a petrification ray in a campaign once as well, just to frighten the party into knowing that what they were facing was something weird. Like if the Beholder disintegrated someone, I feel like that would have had a different effect to them petrifying and turning someone to stone instantly. There was just an extra little kind of flavor of the unnatural there.
See, I'm going to go off book here because somehow I want a levitation ray. And you might think, big deal. You put someone up in the air. Well, it's fun. It lets the characters maybe work around it a little bit. But then what you do is maybe you have the ray hold them up there until the start of the Beholder's next turn. And then at the start of the Beholder's next turn, they turn their anti-magic ray on them up in the air. And, oh, well, I can feather fall. I can fly. Oh, no, I can't. And then splat goes the character. So I think that would be fun. And I could see evil beholders just doing that to taunt characters.
Very nice. The weirder, the better.
Mm-hmm.
I just think of that bit in Fellowship of the Ring where Saruman points his staff at Gandalf. He goes like spinning like a helicopter up into the top of the tower.
Have you seen Willow, James?
It's been like a decade. Yeah.
There's a fight sort of near the end of that movie between two sort of arch sorceresses that I think of every time I watch that part of The Lord of the Rings. But the sound effects in Willow is like, and so that's what is running through my head whenever I see that.
Well, just before we get into the big news this week, because there is big news this week in some manner of speaking. Speaking of big things, James Hake, you are going to the Big Bad Con, which is next weekend?
It's this weekend. I'm leaving in 3 days. Big Bad Con is a fairly young but potent convention in San Francisco, California. People who I think are putting it on are Ajit George and Anthony Riviera. Anthony is our writer for episode 6 of Pirates of the Ethereal Expanse, a great guy. And Ajit George works with a number of very cool humanitarian organizations, particularly in South India, and is a great advocate for people of color in the gaming space. And that's kind of, the con, Big Bad Con, is open to everyone, but to my understanding, its main mission is to promote diversity within the tabletop gaming space. And that's something that I'm very passionate about as well. It's something that I want for Ghostfire Gaming, something I want for all game companies, is to look beyond the sort of typical roster of white designers who show up in basically every book. But the thing is that when opportunities are not given to young designers who, have not proved themselves, many of whom don't have a ladder up into this space, well, they'll never get the ladder. So the main thing that I'm heading down to Big Bad Con to do, other than play games, have fun, meet a bunch of new people, is specifically to go to the POC designer meet and greet, a big sort of ballroom event that happens at this convention where a lot of designers of color, whether they're writers or editors or graphic designers or mechanical balance people, QA people, playtesters, stuff like that, come to the con, and through a survey that I and a bunch of other established industry people have filled out, kind of match interests. Young designers, untested designers with established industry professionals. And I'm just excited to meet a lot of new people through names of people discovered through Big Bad Con and Ajit. We've brought people on to Fables and other projects like that in the past. And I'm just hoping to continue that tradition and just kind of be a beacon for all of Ghostfire Gaming's needs as we, look to the future. We look to who are going to be the young designers, freelancers that we work with in our next 5 years of games.
Is there anywhere else specific that folks will be able to find you while you're at Big Bad Con?
Well, I'm not running any games. I made the decision to come to Big Bad Con pretty late in the game.
Sure.
Even PAX Australia was kind of a hard decision for me to make. And so, my schedule is very open. I'm going to be at that meet and greet, but generally I'm going to be at the con, wandering around, saying hello to people, dropping in on games, and just generally checking out what the con has to offer, because I don't know too much about it other than year after year I hear Big Bad Con is amazing. Big Bad Con is fantastic. I'm like, okay, let's find out what this big bad thing is all about.
Speaking of conventions, very quickly, our panel from PAX Australia just went live a few hours ago on the Ghostfire podcast YouTube channel. So that has Dael, James, myself, and Phil Beckwith, who's the project manager for Ghostfire Gaming, standing in for Shawn. So go check that out.
It's so pretty. The video quality is so
well
good.
shot. Yes, I know. I don't know whether this comes across like a backwards compliment, like a backhanded compliment. I did not expect it to look as good as it did. It looks really nice.
Damn.
What were you saying? It looks like a Comic-Con panel. It looks like it's that high quality. It's that professional looking.
I know there's a few people in the chat who came along to that, so thank you very much for coming along. It was a lot of fun. A sort of panel about how to possibly find your way into the RPG industry. It wasn't necessarily a how-to guide, because that's a very difficult thing to necessarily provide for people, but just shared experiences and what it's like working on small and larger projects. And then, of course, Shawn, this weekend just passed, you were at Gamehole Con, running games there. What was that like? How'd you go?
Gamehole Con is a really great con. I would call it a small local con with a big guest list. So it has sort of the guest list that you would get at a Gen Con or a large PAX, but squished down into a smaller convention. So the panels are great, and a normal panel, you might have 400, 500 people in the audience, and at this, there's 30 or 40 people in the audience, and you can sit down and rub shoulders with the designers whose games you play. So it's lots of fun as a con. Joe Rosso, who is the writing director for Fables going forward, was there with me running a preview of the Fables 3 adventure. And we had a rollicking good time. There was one table where at the end of the adventure, 2 PCs, all of the bad guys, and about 300 innocents were destroyed. So that was good. That was a good day's work.
Yeah, I recall hearing about your brutality on Twitter.
Yes. And Joe and I did a panel about what goes into game design for a company like Ghostfire. So we talked not just about game design, but about art and about layout and about all of the things that you may not think about as a player or as a game master, but these are things that we think about. And there are also a lot of novice game designers there, or people looking to get into game design as freelancers. So we sort of said, now think about these things. Think about the art that needs to happen or the layout that needs to happen as you are a freelancer, because that will give you a leg up with the work that you're doing. You can think about that as well as your mechanics or your story or what have you. Yeah.
I think we can kind of see a theme emerging from all of these con appearances, whether it's PAX Australia or Big Bad or even Gamehole Con, where it's like we want people to start making RPGs. RPGs, the industry as a whole, is really only as strong as the people doing new and creative things within it. And the range of experiences that people from all walks of life have brings vital new ideas and new color to the sort of stew as a whole. And so I guess just to like PSA out to the audience, out of people listening right here, if you have an RPG idea, make it and share it on Twitter or share it somewhere. Send it to people who you want to critique it. The more it's played and the more you get mentorship and the more you just put yourself out there, the better the world will be for having your RPG in it. Truly, I mean that.
And dare I say, there's no better time to put your stuff out there than while everyone's in panic mode and D&D's a little bit shaky.
Yes, indeed. Well, speaking of panic mode and D&D being a little bit shaky, there is big news which James Hake sent me, I think, like 6 hours after we recorded last week's episode.
Without fail.
We will never win on the keeping things fresh. I feel like we're just a little bit ahead of the news cycle, but whatever. So yeah, all right, lots of news. I just want to preface this a little bit by saying it's big news with very little concrete information that I know of at this point. So there may be a little bit of speculation going into this, keeping in mind that this is business news, which does kind of eke into people's personal business a little bit. So while I think it's fun to speculate on the future of the game, I hope that we I don't know, I'm just prefacing that in case I accidentally say something that is maybe treading on someone's personal toes, which I don't intend to. But this big news that I have alluded to,
professional toes. Yeah,
I'm happy to tread on people's professional toes. Tread on those all day. They should be wearing steel cap boots to work, frankly. Ray Winninger, who was the executive producer of, sorry, I just wanted to get his job title right. The executive producer of D&D formerly, has quietly disappeared from Wizards of the Coast. Now, the facts...
That makes it sound like... like he got disappeared.
Well, kind of, because here's the thing. All right, I'm just going to lay out the facts, right? This is what we know is true. Ray Winninger did not announce that he had left Wizards. He quietly removed his role as Wizards from his Twitter bio, which was noted by someone else within the community, I believe David Hartledge. And that is when Ray came out and said, yes, indeed, I am no longer... the Wizards of the Coast executive, or no longer the Dungeons and Dragons executive producer specifically, which just this is where the speculation comes in. That turn of events seems a little bit cloak and dagger, as you noted, Dael. The fact that there was no announcement, it was just see if anybody notices that he's no longer listed as the executive producer. And since there's been some speculation in the community whether this was a result of Dan Rawson coming in, I think as I've got VP there. I'm not sure what that stands for off the top of my head. But also Ray's role seems to have been directly succeeded by Kyle Brink, who's been with Wizards of the Coast for a little while, but suspiciously has a very video game design history professionally as well. So
I want to jump in and talk for a second
Please.
about the circumstances which led to Ray Winninger entering the D&D team. Because I think they actually might shed some light on the subtlety with which he left the team. Ray Winninger has a long history with D&D. If I remember right, he was with TSR. He wrote a series of well-known articles called Dungeon Craft, which survive in plain text on the internet, archived somewhere. You Google Dungeon Craft, will come up. And since then, he's had a long and storied career as a narrative and experience designer in a lot of other fields. I'm about 90% sure of this, so maybe don't quote me. But if I remember right, he has done theme park design. He's done really big sort of game designy things outside the field of game design. And this is where I get into full speculation. I suspect he was brought into Wizards of the Coast just kind of, he got called up because he's well known within the D&D sort of historical sphere, being like, hey, we want some help. We want some guidance moving 5e into the future. And you're a smart guy with history and you have that outsider experience. Let's bring you in for a little bit and see where you can go from there. And if he has all of this outside game design like experience, but with, bigger properties in Dungeons and Dragons, I don't think that's a slight against D&D to say that. He would basically be taking a pay cut out of passion and, sort of historical love for D&D, being like, yes, okay, I'm going to go in, I'm going to do a little tinkering, I'm going to right the ship if that's what I'm being asked to do. And then it's like, my work here is done. Farewell. I disappear into the night again. That's the sort of...
I will return to my planet.
Just like Homer Simpson through the hedge. That kind of is what happened, to be fair.
That's the sort of image of Ray, who I've only met once or twice, that
Sure.
I have in my head. Is he was called in out of the blue for a very specific task. He did that task and he was like, and that is it. Farewell. So I don't know. I feel no real suspicion over the quiet immediacy of his departure.
I'm going to go completely the opposite direction that James went.
Ooh.
Yeah. I'm going to say that, well, first of all, I want to talk about Dan Rawson, because I think this is a new position that they created.
Yeah.
That he is filling. I don't think he is replacing anyone. I think this is a new position that they feel they need filled. And from what I've read of Dan Rawson, while he is, an e-commerce and digital executive, that's his focus. From everything I've heard, he is also a gamer. He also played D&D as a kid. He plays D&D with his kids. He was an ex-Marine. He is also a Harvard, I believe, graduate with his bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Northwestern. So that is a pretty smart pedigree, a pretty tough pedigree. I believe this is somebody who knows what they're doing, both in terms of business and in terms of games. So I fear nothing with his hire. I don't think there's any nefarious dealings going on there. I am curious of the departure of Ray. I was keeping an eye on things on Twitter, and I noticed when his Twitter bio changed, and it was right around the time of the Spelljammer release. And I think we remember what happened. I remember what happened with the Spelljammer release, and I think that might have shaken Wizards and Hasbro a little bit more than has been reported or that has been speculated, right? The Hadazee race was included in Spelljammer. It turned out that its lore was a little bit cringe, to say that. That's putting it very mildly. And I think somebody had to end up paying the price for that. And I may be wrong. It may have nothing to do with that. But with D&D being such a big focus of not just Wizards of the Coast, but of Hasbro going forward, if I was an executive at Hasbro and that happened, I would say we need to send a message that this cannot happen. And somebody has to go. Who would be at the top of that? Who was responsible? I'm not saying Ray was responsible, but he was the executive producer of D&D. So if you're going to say the buck stops with me, then that's where the buck stops.
Absolutely. I think, Shawn, you and I have done a great job presenting two very polarized opinions. Right. I'm very curious to see. We may never know. We may never know what the actual truth
of course
is. But it's
hopefully
cool
we never know.
Such,
yeah. Well, see, because I thought something not dissimilar to your thoughts, Shawn, and I think what was going around on Twitter was similarly suspicious, not so much about the Spelljammer controversy, which I hadn't thought of connecting those two, but I didn't know when Ray had removed his title from his Twitter post or his Twitter profile, but that because they're moving in a more digital direction specifically, that Ray sort of moved out because that was not his personal area of expertise. Whereas the people that they're bringing in, like Dan Rawson and like Kyle Brink, who, as mentioned, has been at Wizards for a while now, but seems to be taking Ray's former position, have a lot more history in video game design and the sort of digital space. And because that's the direction D&D seems to be heading, and we'll dive into that a little bit in a moment, that may have contributed to Ray kind of going on their long rest, as they very, very strategically said on their Twitter. Yeah.
The longest rest.
They go to their longest rest.
If you're ever running like a mafia in D&D, it's just like, we'll give him a long rest,
Yeah, we'll give him a long rest.
yeah, he's gonna have the longest.
We'll teach him about regaining all of his spell slots.
He's gonna get all his hit points back, if you know what I mean. Wait a second.
Emphasis on the hit.
Fantastic. So related to this, we in the last couple of weeks have gotten at least 3 listener emails all asking fundamentally the same question, which is looking at the rules for One D&D and how they seem to be creating more clarity and perhaps complexity around things from 5th edition that had been left a little bit more open and to the game master's discretion in terms of how easy is it to influence a NPC? Well, now there's an influence action that players can specifically ask to take. How does exhaustion work? Even seems a bit more, even though I quite like the new exhaustion rules, they seem a bit more numerical rather than conceptual in terms of the disadvantages that they impose. All of this to say, are these new rules being moved in this direction because it is easier for a computer to understand those rules than it is the nuances of a GM kind of making rulings on the fly around things like, how much damage does a chair do as an unarmed, or an improvised weapon or whatever it happens to be. And therefore, is D&D moving in a direction where with the 3D virtual tabletop, it may start looking like something from Divinity Original Sin 2's Game Master mode or DM mode or whatever it was called, where basically, the Game Master is putting inputs into the computer as the players kind of describe what they want to do. The players are putting inputs in and the game kind of plays itself out.
Okay, so I can't help but feel like I personally may have contributed a little bit to this over the last, couple months or whatever, because I am suspicious of that exact thing, right? I am looking at these new rules and going, these seem much more technically direct. And I'm someone who likes there to be space in my RPG design that lets me decide things, particularly in areas where human judgment is necessary to kind of make those calls. When you're doing a social encounter, ultimately human judgment is always going to win out over top of, something like saying, this is the DC in order to persuade or intimidate. Like, these are the only things you can do, rather than having a conversation, right? So I have been the person here saying, they're heading in a digital direction. And I do think that it's true, but I just wanted to mitigate it a little bit as we're heading into this discussion, because now that we've got a very clear example with Ray Winninger and Carl Brink and all this stuff, that does look like specifically Dungeons and Dragons heading in a video gamey direction, I'm suddenly aware of every time I've said that about like Wizards of the Coast people, someone hired for Wizards of the Coast who has a background in video games. But I just want to like backtrack on those things from previous episodes and maybe recognize finally that it's not all about us. Like, you go to the Wizards of the Coast website and they're like, these are our games. And it's like 5 Magic the Gathering games and then D&D, right? So some of that is going to be about the fact that Magic the Gathering is a huge presence and they do have digital platforms and video game-esque products in Magic the Gathering already. So I'm just saying before we get into it, like, don't entirely panic about it. I don't think that we can ever reach a point where D&D can run without a DM, right? That's never going to happen because it won't be D&D anymore. You would have to completely eradicate something like the social pillar of play in order to have a computer be able to run it. And for players to have that freedom that is the kind of core draw card that tabletop RPGs have over a video game, that freedom can't be replicated in a computer. I don't believe.
AI
Once we
would
get
have to
AI,
get
maybe,
real good.
yeah. Once Cortana is running games, then maybe we can talk.
Didn't Amazon Alexa or something have a Alexa run D&D command at one point? Didn't that? And she would do a very, very simple choose your own adventure novel. I remember this being news about a year or two ago. It was cute, but it wasn't D&D. It wasn't a full game mastered experience.
That's the thing. It's that difference between a choose your own adventure, which has elements that are like a tabletop RPG, versus a tabletop RPG where you actually can choose to do something completely not thought of.
I love to sit with the grognardy gamers that I play with or that I am used to, have worked with in the past, and tease them that they will not sell paper copy books. It's all going to be digital, and see their heads spin around and pea soup spit out of their mouth as they froth at the idea that this would ever happen. But I agree with Dael completely. I think we have to separate digital from e-commerce when we talk about these things. So e-commerce is a whole different business than a digital game. We will never, as Dael said, we will never have a Dungeons and Dragons game without a game master, without a dungeon master, because we love the story element. We used to joke that 4th edition, the DM could walk away and the players could finish the combat on their own. And in some cases, it almost did work out that way. But then the DM would have to come back to tell the story and to ask the question, what do you do now? And I hope that's always the case.
It might be a bit much to be like, is the DM going to become obsolete? But in trying to expand the options that folks have for playing role-playing games online and with virtual tabletops and all that jazz, it can simultaneously restrict what is possible because, let's say, I think that going off memory, and don't quote me on this, that the sales tactic for the 3D virtual tabletop that Wizards are developing has reportedly been that they will sell adventures in packs, and you'll get everything you need to run that adventure in the virtual tabletop, and then you'll get all the pieces from that adventure as well to be able to piece together your own dungeon made from that thing, right? And then as you buy more adventures and more packs, you expand your sort of repertoire and what's in your digital library to be able to create different dungeons. But for me, that's extremely unsatisfying, because I like to homebrew dungeons, I like to homebrew scenarios, I like to homebrew monsters quite a lot. And it's why I don't use physical terrain. I use a whiteboard or a wet erase mat with markers, because then an encounter can happen literally anywhere, right? Whereas once you're using a virtual tabletop that's relatively inflexible, and it looks like this 3D one will be that, at least in some capacity, suddenly I'm restricted because I want to have them explore a mummy tomb that looks very sort of Egyptian, and all I have is these, dark grey swamp dungeon tiles, because that's all that is currently available on the store or whatever it happens to be. And so I think that there's some anxiety in the restriction in that sense, but also restriction in how people access D&D, because more people are using D&D Beyond, I think, organically, and that's fine. But Wizards potentially have that ability to kind of, really restrict how people play D&D in terms of, sure, your books won't burst into flames suddenly when a new book is released. Volo's and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes didn't spontaneously combust when Monsters of the Multiverse released. But they did redo all those monsters through D&D Beyond. And while you can still access the original versions, you cannot access... there is potential for them to just kind of rewrite what they want the game to be and reintroduce it through those systems. So if you've tied yourself into D&D Beyond or some sort of video gamey digital offering, you're kind of stuck to the whims of what Wizards want to do with that platform going forward.
Yeah. Beyond that as well, the same thing when we talk about these new rules, right? The more you clarify rules so that they can be understood and run by a computer, the more you restrict what those rules are able to replicate. That's just something that happens a little bit. And that I do agree with, and that I think, sure, go ahead and panic about it.
This brings us to a broader argument about the nature of RPGs that I've seen play out online a lot over the past couple of years, particularly within the indie space, than people who have criticisms of D&D to levy. And it's about RPGs as a complete or incomplete game. I might have even talked about it a little bit before on this very podcast. But the thing about a video game is, if you were to purchase a big budget AAA video game and they at any point said, and now you make it up, you'd be pissed. You would be rightfully angry, because I paid 60 USD. I paid 100 Australian dollars for this video game. It's a AAA video game.
You learned down prices while you were here.
120 if it's a PS5 game.
120 Australian dollars.
It's ridiculous.
You're shelling out a big amount of money to a large company to play a game, and they tell you it's not finished. They tell you not only is there not DLC that you can buy to round out the experience, you have to make it. Not you can make it, you have to make it. There are some people who really get up in arms about that. And I think there's a pretty solid argument for why they would. I paid a lot of money for this game. It had better be good, and it better be finished. And yet, what we're talking about, people who love D&D for its incompleteness, for its openness, for its ability to inspire creativity, and in fact, have a requisite need for creativity brought to it by the players, see that there's a completely other side to this argument. Once you complete D&D, it's not really D&D anymore. And that's how it goes for a lot of different RPGs. There are some RPGs out there that are complete games, but they're more like, Descent, where I would not play Descent campaign style. I would not play, Descent is a dungeon crawl style board game where all the bits and bobs are laid out for you, and there's kind of a beginning and an end, and each encounter is really tightly designed to use its game mechanics, and like the designers kind of know every step of the way where you're going to go, how you're going to get there. I wouldn't play Descent for session after session after session after session the way I would D&D, because part of the D&D experience for me is that spontaneity. It's that improvisational aspect of it, both as a player and as a DM. I love being surprised as a DM. And if I have every card in my hand while I'm running from my table, I just would not like that as much as the alternative.
One thing that is interesting, especially considering what Ben was saying about, the buying of stuff online, digital products, is that particularly if we do think that this is going in a direction of lessening to some degree the role of the DM, one thing that is interesting to bring up there, it's not necessarily an argument for or against that being the case, but currently dungeon masters are the ones who buy the most D&D products. If you are buying a ton of D&D books or accessories, you are probably the DM. And what is interesting to think about is the possibility that if they go in a terrible direction and require every player to buy their own book, their own copy of the book in order to participate in the digital play, which I hope they don't. That just seems like a bad idea. But if they did do that, they could, from their attempt to transform it into an economy where the players are buying most of the stuff rather than it being the DMs. And then that would lead to possibly choosing to lessen the role of the DM in the game. But I think it's unlikely.
I don't know. That sounds like the nut that RPG companies have been trying to crack for decades now. Is how do you get 4/5 of your gaming group player base to actually buy your product instead of 1/5 who buys everything?
I think it might be the dream. If they could do it, they would do it. But I think the trouble is that you've always got Paizo and Pathfinder waiting in the wings going like, everything's available for free online.
Yeah, I suppose, but even Paizo and Pathfinder are doing 5e content right now. Like, I feel like there's a lot of, feel like the reason there's so much anxiety at the moment within the community is because D&D 5e has become so dominant even over other fantasy role-playing games like Pathfinder in the last sort of 5 years. And it's extremely dominant on the industry because there's a lot of third-party companies that kind of rely on 5e having its open game license. And if, we've kind of talked about from a consumer's point of view, they are anxious around like, how will they interact with Dungeons and Dragons? How will they be able to purchase their products? What does ownership mean when the majority of your content becomes digital rather than physical? And there's just so much uncertainty about which way Wizards or Hasbro are going to turn. And so like on all sides, it just feels like the industry is like collectively holding its breath for the next 2 years to be like, and like what is this going to look
like?
Where
do we land? What's the landscape?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's incredibly exciting and yet anxiety inducing at the same time, depending on where you are within the industry.
It's more exciting when you're not a publisher.
that is truer words, my friend. Well, yeah, I've spent the last 40 years hearing how the computer is going to replace us, and entertainment will never be the same, and games will disappear, and movies will disappear, and everything will disappear, and everything will be horrible. And it's sort of the same thing with D&D, right? Every new edition, this is going to be the end of D&D. And somehow we're still here playing and talking about and enjoying or hate playing these games. And life will go on, and there will be something for us to do to make our creativity shine in this little hobby of ours.
Something that I think is worth remembering at times like this, if you feel so stressed out about it, is just remember that plays still exist. Books still exist. Movies didn't kill plays. TV shows didn't kill books. It's all still here. And maybe a new prime form of, a new medium will take over as like dominant form, but the thing that you love is never gonna completely vanish. Stuff doesn't die like that, even if we like to sort of catastrophize and suggest that video did indeed kill the radio star. People still listen to the radio.
Podcasts still exist, like this very one here.
I don't believe you.
Well, we also put it to YouTube, and we have people watching us right now on Twitch. So, but they might have their windows minimized. You don't know. Anyway, speaking of minimizing things, you don't always need to kill monsters in combat. You can just minimize the threat that they pose in the narrative that you're telling. And that relates to Gethin's question, emailed podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. Gethin did. Thank you. Smooth as a good scotch. Drink responsibly. Gethin is asking about crafting alternative win conditions into combat other than the monster's death. I think we've mentioned it a few times on this podcast, and Gethin's looking for directed advice for providing that, and also hinting, or how do you hint / incentivize players to engage with those alternative win conditions rather than just reduce the monster to 0 hit points, because the most favorable condition to impose on an enemy is dead.
I want Ben to tell his story that I heard while in Melbourne about the ghost your players had to deal with. That you specifically mentioned that the ghost had been defeated by other adventurers before, but it just always sort of remanifested. I want you to tell that story because I think it's a good example of this.
Okay, well, don't mind if I do. Thank you, Dael. My approach to ghosts, which I did a video on, you can find it on Ghostfire Gaming YouTube. Anyway, my approach to ghosts is very tied in with the supernatural, as in the TV show, way of dealing with them, which is that ghosts cannot be destroyed by reducing them to 0 hit points. They cannot be destroyed by attacking them. They will just reform and come back, and that can take several hours or it can take several years for the ghost to reform. But to destroy it, you need to find its earthly remains and destroy those, or potentially finish the ghost's business. And so there were 2 ghosts that I had. One was a murder mystery with a lake, and one was a wraith that haunted a farm. It was based on like the witch's noon wraith. There you go. And the idea was that these wraiths, let's talk about the Rizolka from the pond. Basically, the idea was that it drowns people who come down to the water, like any classic kind of like, individual in a pond, come swim in the water's fine. Haha, drown you.
Like kangaroos, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You have learned so much over the last few weeks. They do that. So the idea was that the party could attempt to swim down to the bottom of the lake and recover the bones of the person who had died, like I think 10, 20 years earlier, and destroy those remains to destroy the ghost. But because the ghost is layering on top of their remains, they would have to fight the ghost in their lair where they are strongest. And when it's underwater, it's an incredibly dangerous fight for the party to engage with, especially if you don't have someone who can breathe underwater or a swimming speed. And the idea was that it was really murky as well. It was kind of like a muddy kind of creek, and so visibility was really poor. The same with the Noon Wraith. The idea was that their remains were buried under a tree on the farm, but if you went to fight the Noon Wraith, it was an incredibly difficult battle. In both these circumstances, the victim didn't deserve necessarily to die. There was a kind of story around how they passed away. In the circumstances of the Noon Wraith, they had been, warning, this is slightly graphic, burned alive on their farm as punishment from a local kind of mobster guild. And the Rizolka had been drowned kind of as a murder mystery. Nobody knew who drowned them.
They gave them the long rest.
Yeah, they restored all their hit points. Made them resistant to fire damage, 0. If you know what I mean. And so the idea is that, yes, the party can just go fight, recover these remains, but it's an incredibly dangerous battle to do. Or they can investigate the village, they can investigate the mob and try to bring those people to justice, which in the case of the mob sends the party on this relatively large quest where they're hunting down the 5 individuals who killed the person who became the ghost, which those 5 individuals altogether are very formidable as a threat, but you split them up and kind of take them out one by one, they're much less dangerous. And it just resulted in a couple of really formidable but also beautiful moments of roleplay within those 2 campaigns. The reason I use both these examples is because they had kind of slightly different endings, but I think created a really satisfying story both ways. In the case of the Rizalka, they found who murdered the Rizalka, took them down to the water, and this person is like terrified of the ghost. They're like, no, please don't do this. You don't know what you're doing. And the party bring this person to the Rizalka, say, here, we found the murderer, and the water swells up almost like a little tidal wave, grabs onto this person. They get dragged into the lake, and you see the bubbles on the surface for a few moments, and then it disappears. And that person has been drowned, and the ghost is never seen again. Whether as in the case of the Noon Wraith, they went down, they hunted down the individuals. There was a paladin in the party who made it their personal quest to get justice for this Noon Wraith, and then came back to the farm. And instead of being this grisly kind of scorched up appearing corpse, the person appeared as they did when they were alive, because they felt much more peaceful. And without a word of actual dialogue, just description, the paladin basically sits on the root of the tree where the ghost is buried. She sits next to him, and they just wait for the sun to rise. And as the sun kind of comes up and the light shines over the farm, her form just fades away and she's gone. And it was just chef kiss kind of end, particularly to a dark fantasy campaign, because it's so bittersweet, you know? So basically, to break it down to answer Gethin's questions, make the fights hard. Make it undesirable to fight. If you just overtune it and make the CR a little bit higher, then the party will be incentivized.
Very little reward.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to tackle this from a totally different angle, because this is such a great response to this from a narrative point of view. I want to look at this from a sort of tactical miniatures game point of view, because that's kind of the other side of the D&D token. And all of my experience in this comes from playing video games, tactical video games like Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics or things like that, because games like that often have objectives that are not simply kill them all. They vary things up, and because they're sort of grid based, I think there's a pretty good analogy to be found here. Because there are discrete spaces on a map, reach a location is a perfectly good resolution to a combat, and that dovetails really well with your hard combats idea, because that's the kind of the nugget of wisdom at the core of any discussion here, is that you need to disincentivize fighting. You need to find some way to make fighting more challenge than it's worth to do so. And in tactics games, typically the way they do that is by having a lot of bad guys, rather than one really strong, sort of narratively compelling monster like your wraiths. A late game Fire Emblem map will have 50 dudes against your army of 8 to 12 guys, and if you're trying to capture a castle or escape, just eliminate one boss monster or something like that, then you can really make the challenge not just, hey, look at how tough this one guy is. There's a lot of terrain and circumstances and enemy waves and other things that are all putting pressure on you to reach the actual objective as fast as you possibly can without sort of dawdling and getting overwhelmed.
Every type of battle with a win condition that's other than killing has its own problems. Getting from point A to point B, one of the most fun encounters I ever had, it was simply, you need to get across this huge field. And there were monsters and traps and all sorts of things in the way. But you need to be very, very clear. Do not do not hesitate as the game master to let them know in no uncertain terms, this is the point of this combat. This is the point of this encounter.
Right.
Because if you don't be very explicit with that direction, default for most players is I'm going to hit the thing that's right in front of me as many times as possible. And sometimes even if you are explicit about what the goal is, that tendency to want to fight will still overwhelm the players and force them for some reason to use the sword and the spell and the sneak attack on their sheet rather than doing what the point of the actual point of the encounter is.
So I want to press the button.
Yes.
Press the attack button.
If you do something like, you must stop this ritual from happening, the first thing the players are going to do is say, well, the easiest way to stop the ritual is to kill everybody involved. So you need to not even make the combat very difficult, but make it clear that fighting is not the best way to do this. And again, you can come right out and say it. You can come right out and say it as the game master. You can try to be subtle and put it in to clues either before this encounter or during the encounter. But again, subtlety is sometimes lost when the bloodlust surges in your players. So, be as transparent as possible. And then you can sort of have fun. Another way to think of it is think of the CR of the thing that you're trying to get the players to do and just count that thing as a monster. To stop the ritual, would it take 6 successful skill checks or a certain amount of damage or pushing the right button at the right time? Well, if it would take the party 6 shots to kill one of the monsters, then it should take 6 shots to kill that encounter. And that way you can balance it, but you can set it up so that they can't even touch the monsters until this other thing is done. And that, it's one way to do it. There are many other ways to do it. But what's also important is to play test, to see if the way you've set it up works, or if your clues are too subtle, or if the way you've gated the encounter works or not. It's always important to do that as well.
Yeah, everything Shawn just said is exactly up the alley of what I was going to say. So the thing that Ben has described is like the ideal situation, right? It's this nuanced approach where you're not stopping your players from choosing to fight. They have that option that is always available to them, but you're giving them a reason to want to do something else. You're tempting them to. I always think that tempting players to do something is more effective than threatening them to not do something, because if you challenge your players and say, this fight's just too strong for you, they're going to want to prove you wrong, right? So Ben's is like a beautiful nuanced setup. It's wonderful. I can only dream of running stuff like that. But then on the other end of the spectrum, Shawn's right. You can cut the corner and just tell your players, here's what's up. These waves of bad guys are not going to stop coming, right? It's that old pearl of wisdom that the game of D&D is not what happens at the table. It's the memory of it afterwards when you're talking with your friends in the car park. It's okay to break the immersion for a bit and just be direct with your players. I'm reminded of a Dimension 20 episode of, I think it was Unsleeping City, where the goal was you're waiting for a train. A train is going to arrive and it's going to take you away from here. But in the meantime, you're going to get lots of waves of bad guys coming at you. But they were told,
classic elevator.
Yeah, they were told directly at the beginning of combat, here's what you can do to speed up the train's arrival. You can take these other actions that aren't combat and it will improve your chances of that, end sort of, what's it called in game design, that thing of like, this is the thing that triggers the end of the encounter. There's a word for it. I don't know what it is.
The end game?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll take it. This is an explicit end game that isn't every enemy dies. And here's how you can achieve that thing.
A victory condition.
Yeah, win condition. Yeah. Thank you, chat. But no, that sort of thing of being explicit, telling them what the difference is between this encounter and any other encounter where they would just fight to the death. Sometimes it's just worthwhile to do that if you don't have time or think that your party won't necessarily be amenable to the more subtle and nuanced approach.
Yeah. For sure.
I think there's another subtle and nuanced approach that we can glean from looking at the past. D&D inspired a lot of video games to have experience points. Experience points started in early D&D, and video games picked it up, and video games gave you experience points for killing monsters. We can see that as early as Final Fantasy I in the 80s. But D&D didn't always used to give you experience points for killing monsters. Its incentive system was different. Its incentive system was based around gold and treasure. And so there may be, and I think this is maybe a little overstated, but it's worth saying, it may be worth it if you want to create other victory conditions to make it so that fighting isn't such a good thing. Players measurably, numerically, like empirically get stronger the more monsters they kill if you play with XP in play. So if you make it so that the way that they improve in advancement is something other than fighting, then they may consider an option that isn't fighting.
Last question here, which comes from James, but not that one, who also emailed podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. Get your emails in and we will answer them here on the podcast. They had a very simple question. It was just about organization of notes and info about encounters and dungeons as a game master. How do you organize your info, your descriptions, your room descriptions or kind of descriptive text, your puzzles, your layout of a room or a dungeon or an encounter? How many monsters are there? Where do you put your stat blocks? All of that sort of stuff on a macro and micro scale. And just for the game designers in the room, I more so mean, or I think James really more so means, as a game master, more so than necessarily like as a writer of adventures, because those two things might be slightly different.
Unless I'm writing it for publication, I have a monster stat block and that's all. Because I'm just going to have some fun. If I'm going to publish something, it's terrible. I know, but how I would do it would be anything I need to know above the descriptive text that I'm going to read to tell me what's in the room that's important for the players to know beforehand. Beneath that, any monsters. Well, actually, let's switch that around. Description of what's there, and then what comes first. Is there a big feature that I need to know about first? Is the monster coming right at them when they enter the area? Put the monster first. Is there a trap they need to deal with before the monster comes? Put the trap first. So I do it in the order of what the characters are going to encounter.
Same. I'm probably a little bit more neurotic than Shawn when it comes to having notes prepared. I've tried so many different, so I'm a really forgetful DM. I have tried, post-it notes that you pull down once you've read the thing that you need to read. I always forget something that I have to mention that's important for me to mention. The system I've had the most success with is I just have my notebook and I write out and I've mentioned before that I write my own box text, and I'll have, the first thing I expect them to encounter, and I'll write out the thing that I want to be sure that I say about that. And then I'll do them in the order that I expect the players to encounter them. If they skip something, I skip over it, rearranging gets hard, but this is, so far it's working okay. Write them in the order that I expect them to encounter them. Any DCs are right there kind of in that section that I need to deal with. And then at a separate part of the notebook, I just have my stat blocks for monsters written out sort of separately, and really short, brief stat blocks. I mean, I've railed against official stat blocks before because I think that they're in a confusing order and there's much more information than you actually need. So I just have my very abbreviated and homebrewed stat blocks that are like, at some point during the combat, make sure that you do this cool thing so that it's memorable. But the rest of it's like super duper simplified.
I'm really working my brain here because I don't think I've run a game in months. My home group is on hiatus. I was just out of the country.
This is relatable. It hurts.
This is the pain of a game designer. Don't become a game designer, folks. I'll contradict what I said earlier. You'll never have time to play games ever again. No, but thinking back, my approach varies wildly based on how story relevant an encounter is. I'll often have encounters that begin with a map, and I'll look at a map and I'll think of, I want to use this map, and then everything will kind of come together when I want to deploy the map. I'll have encounters where I'm like, I've got a monster stat block, and everything will kind of come together when I want to deploy the monster stat block. Sometimes there's a character, a villain, and I'll think of the villain's motivations and all that. And oftentimes the map and the monster stat block will kind of come together when it's needed. But that is because that's not a system I particularly like, but it's a system that I've had to develop because the reason why I put my group on hiatus is because prepping D&D has started to feel like work for me. Yeah. And so the more low prep I could become, the less playing the game felt like my job. And so I would come up with one kind of rallying point for myself, like a map or a stat block or a character, and then I would just rely upon the knowledge of having run this game for 10 years and spent a lot of time picking it apart professionally to kind of guide me in the moment. I'd love to do very, very intricate sort of dioramas of things and plan out tactics for monsters and different things that happen on different turns. It's so cool. It appeals to something game designerly inside me, but as it's not going to happen until I've had a real long vacation, I think.
Yeah.
I just don't know that it works for me. Yeah. I suppose, I don't know whether this is also worth saying in terms of organization, right? Because that's kind of the heart of the question. I make all my notes and stuff ahead of time, super like over the top complicated in orders that don't make sense in a separate notebook. And then ahead of the actual session, I transfer the information that I actually need into a different notebook in the order that I anticipate it will happen. And there's much less of it and it's much more simplified. But I start with chaos and then I figure it out.
I can't sing the praises of OneNote highly enough. I think it is an excellent
I thought you were
piece
saying
of
I can't sing the praises of OneNote.
No, I love OneNote. I think the reason that I love OneNote so much is because it breaks down in terms of its pages to folders to whatever it is, groupings like a dungeon does. And so you can, create a folder and that's your dungeon, and then the dungeon has like categories, and so I might have all my stat blocks in one category and then all the rooms of the dungeon in another, and then you go to your pages and each page describes a separate room or part of the dungeon, sometimes with the stat blocks in it. I'm going to make a very guilty admission here, which is that when I'm using a PDF monster manual, like the Monster Grimoire, for example, or something like that, I will screenshot the stat block and then just put that into the OneNote so that it's there for me. I actually love the way that how dare I love the way that monster stat blocks are set out, or at least my eye has become used to reading them in the way that they're set out. So if they're in any other hater, format, I can't use them. And then from there it's very similar to I think what Shawn described, which is and Dael for that matter, like my own box text, but it's broken down into dot points rather than like solid box text, so that there's room for me to kind of improvise and like tell the story to the players rather than just reading it. Then whatever's in the room, whether it's monsters most important or whether it's, a trap or something like that. And then the last note, if it's relevant to the room, is always like the treasure that's in the, like, what can they walk out of this room with? And then under that, maybe some screen grabs of the stat blocks if there are monsters in this room. So it's all on one page. And I am notorious with myself for over prepping. Like James said, it's like, it's become like work for me, but it's also the way that I love to play the game, which is basically design a whole dungeon and then just knock the dominoes down as the players go through the dungeon rather than feel like I'm scrambling to make stuff up.
At a certain point, you're preloading the work. You're doing a ton of work early on so that when you're running the game, you hopefully don't have to do much work. Because your brain's already doing lots of stuff.
This is completely off topic. It has nothing to do with what we've been talking about. But a sort of alchemy happened in my brain during this topic. Dael, you were mentioning really compressed monster stat blocks. Ben, over the past couple of weeks, you've been talking to me about the Monster Hunter and the sort of the Supernatural series book of little monster bits. And also thinking about how things like Volo's Guide often are, they're written ostensibly in first person by a lore character with their little notes and stuff stuck in the margins. And it made me wonder, what if like you think, Dael, we took a monster stat block and we sucked all of the unnecessary verbiage out of it, made it the crunchiest little mechanical nugget we possibly could. Take a full page stat block, shrink it down to a quarter page if we could, by just taking out all the words and just leaving kind of the numbers. So you know what AC means. You've read the introduction to the monster manual. You know what all these things are. This is it. Sort of like the third edition's really tight inline stat blocks. And then for all of the abilities that need a little bit more explanation, like why does the tentacle attack have extra acid damage on it or something like that? Have that sticky note written in that first person style. Draw a big arrow from the note to the stat block and say, when I fought the great tentacula of Carcoon, it scalded me with its tentacular acid. Hey, chat, if anyone of you makes a book like that, would you link me to it? Would you make like a 4-page monster manual exactly like that, with really tight stat blocks and really detailed in-world Monster Hunter writings, and just send it to me? I want to see what that would look like.
Speaking of James wanting to see what things would look like, I'm sure he wants to see what the world away from his computer monitor would look like at this very moment. So therefore, we are going to draw this episode of the Eldritch Lorecast to a close. Thank you, Twitch chat, for hanging out. Twitch.tv/Ghostfire_official. Otherwise, if you're listening to this on YouTube or through an audio platform like Spotify, make sure to give it a rating, like, subscribe, all that stuff. Thank you so much. We just hit 1,000 subscribers on the podcast channel as of yesterday. So thank you so much. I actually literally watched that tick down from the last couple of subscribers. And with all that being said, spread the word of the Eldritch Lorecast, because we will be back next week. I've been Ben Byrne here with Dael Kingsmill, James Hake, Shawn Merwin, and Shawn Merwin's Flumph, and we will be back next week. Bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
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 Goodbye, my lonely island.
Bye-bye.
Baby.
Bye-bye.